Hello, my name is Clara Maveglia and I founded the Cultural Entrepreneurship Institute in Berlin. Today my guest is Susan Neiman. She is philosopher and director of the Einstein Forum in Potsdam. Welcome to our community, Susan Neiman. Guten Tag.
Good afternoon. Good to see you. Would you like to introduce yourself? I'm Susan Neiman, philosopher, director of the Einstein Forum. Okay, you're a philosopher, and a very popular philosopher. And, as you said, you run the Einstein Forum here in Potsdam. But of course, you are a professor, and your books sell like hotcakes. What makes you so successful, so dynamic? Of course, that's a difficult question. But if I have to answer it, I would say I stick with the questions that have always encouraged people to take an interest in philosophy since time immemorial, and when they're 17, not just when they're, I don't know, writing their Ph.Ds or professors. I think that philosophy, in many cases, has lost its way. I could write a long story about that, but what I have always tried to do is to stick with those real questions that really do interest people. And these aren't questions of epistemology, for example. I think that's barking up the wrong tree in philosophy. These are questions relating to ethics, the significance of life, meaning, and I try hard to write the way I like to read. When I wrote my first book, I heard a colleague at Yale tell me, I hope. How did he express himself? Of course, I remember it in English. I hope this won't upset you, but I've heard people have fun reading your book, as if that was an insult. But I do try to write the way I like to read, and that means as little jargon as possible, the sentences as elegant as possible. To me, the Enlightenment is always a good example. The Enlightenment didn't write for specialists, but for normal readers who were interested in things. Kant called them the common world of readers, and we know Kant wasn't a great writer, he said that himself, but in the 15 essays that he wrote for the Berlin Monthly, he could write astoundingly clearly and sometimes elegantly. But what influenced you? What made you the person you are now? What was decisive so that you decided to do this? I think the question, either we would need a whole night talking about that, or even if we did, I think that I don't think I can say of myself or of anyone else, this is what made me the person I am, because there are so many influences. I could begin with my childhood. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, at the time of the Civil Rights Movement, and my mother was involved in that. And that must have been a big influence on me, because I could see with my own eyes that the world changed. Through the efforts of people like my mother, people who weren't intellectuals, she wasn't a politician in that sense. Quite simple, courageous people can change the world. And I remember scenes from my childhood. You couldn't play with black kids, you couldn't go swimming with them, you couldn't go to school with them. That was all completely segregated, and suddenly it wasn't. And that, I think, gave me a sense of hope, which in the last few years, I have to say, has been diluted, I have to say. The world really does not look particularly great at the moment. But that hope that we can move the world a little bit in the direction of where it ought to be is something that was left with me from my childhood, this politically aware childhood. I could mention some books, children's literature by the theologian and literary scientist C.S. Lewis, not as well known here in Germany as they are in the US and Britain, but I devoured those, and it was a lot later that I discovered that he wrote a lot for adults on questions that still interest me about evil and so forth, about morals. That was an influence which I wasn't aware of at the time. And I also have to say that 68 happened to me. It sounds a bit absurd, not really absurd, but hard to believe. But when I was 14, I left home and joined a commune. I thought, like a lot of people did at the time, that the revolution was round the corner and I don't want to miss it. So I did everything you did at the time. I demonstrated against the Vietnam War, tried to live an alternative lifestyle. I was the youngest person in the commune, of course, but I did that for a while. 3 years. Then I got hold of a few books by chance. There was Sartre, his plays. There was Nietzsche, Beyond Good and Evil, and Simone de Beauvoir, the autobiography. And that, of course, is funny, as we know now, but as a 16-year-old in the provinces, I read that and I thought, wow, that sounds a great life. I'm going to be a philosopher. That's how it was. What I couldn't know then, of course, was that wasn't a typical life of a philosopher. I didn't know anyone who read philosophy. I didn't even know anybody who spoke 2 languages. I was a child of the provinces. But as I didn't complete my schooling, I moved to New York, where there was an evening school. You had to pass an exam and then they let you study in the evenings. I worked during the days, and after 2 years I was accepted at Harvard. And I stayed there, all in all, for 8 years. First, it was a disappointment because life at the Department of Philosophy in Harvard wasn't at all like life on the Rive Gauche. And secondly, the philosophical questions that we examined there were completely different. But I was lucky enough to study with a few really fantastic philosophers, John Rawls, Stanley Cavell, a few others, and I was very close to them. Later, I was assistant to Rawls, and the 2 of them supervised my doctorate. But for all the gratitude that I now have towards Harvard, it was too narrow for me. And so I applied for a grant to spend a year in Berlin. And Berlin was a revelation. I used to say at the time, there's more philosophy on every corner pub in Berlin than in the seminar rooms in Harvard. That is a bit of an exaggeration, but nevertheless, I think that life, I don't know if we can say that now, but in that divided city, I wanted to improve my German, in fact learn German at the time. So I would always listen to the news in West Germany and compare it with the news in East Germany. You had two views of the world, which was unimaginable in the big universities of the United States, where we had a very intensive, interesting, profound education, potentially, but often very far removed from reality. So I decided to stay here in Germany, which I did for almost 7 years. I gave birth to my first child here. And then in early 1989, I went back to the United States, which was historically probably a lack of historical sensitivity, because this was a time where everyone was saying there's nothing happening in Berlin any longer. And I had the idea, because during that first period in Berlin, being Jewish, how can I say it, is something I became increasingly aware of compared with the past. In the United States, you can pretty much take it for granted. There are, especially in the cities and among intellectual circles and at the universities, there are enough Jews for it not to be anything special. Even non-Jews make Jewish jokes or talk about Jewish holidays. It's quite normal. Here, of course, that's still not the case, and in the 80s it certainly wasn't the case. For a lot of people, I was the first Jewish woman, if not the first Jew they had ever seen. And for me and my Jewish identity, that confronted me with this. And I wanted to get to know it better, not just be a Jew as a potential victim of a potentially recurring anti-Semitism. And I wanted to be able to raise children in a place where they weren't going to experience any big problems leading a normal life. Easier said than done, but anyway, I applied and I got an assistant professorship at Yale. So off I went. It's idyllic for teaching. And I don't just mean the fact that you don't have to teach as many hours as at other universities. That's the wrong impression. You do teach a few less hours, but what's more important is that you have fewer students, that you can get to know them well. As a professor in the United States, you see teaching as one of the most important parts of the work you do. It's not something you simply do on the side in the hope that you can quickly get back to your own research. Research and teaching really do go hand in hand, much more than in the much vaunted Humboldt University paradigm. Fantastic students, some of them are still today good friends of mine, and that's a wonderful thing. If you can foster a friendship like that for more than 20 years, and you first got to know them when they were only 18, 17, and you can follow their development, usually they were the ones that themselves became professors of philosophy. But the environment and that ivory tower existence in Yale really was not very satisfactory for me. I had had another 2 children, my twin daughters, and I decided to take a year as a sabbatical. And I went to Israel. I'd never been there, but I had a lot of Israeli friends in Yale, actually, who kept telling me, you don't really belong here. you're not really a normal American. We understand that you don't want to go back to Germany. You belong in Tel Aviv. So I thought, okay, I'll try. And they didn't just offer me a professorship, they whisked one out of a hat for me. I stayed there 5 years. They were very interesting years, and I'm very glad that I had that experience. But when the Einstein Forum was looking for a new director, someone approached me, and both the appointments committee at the Einstein Forum and I myself thought, wow, this is the right job for you. This is simply, I was going to say a marriage made in heaven, but the way trite platitudes go, maybe it's not the right one. But on the one hand, of course, you're involved with academic life at the top level, but not within a university, not in an ivory tower, but with the broadest possible of worlds. And that means, first of all our programs are open, anyone can come along, and really anyone from the ambassador to the local grocer does come along. I can invite anyone I want to, as long as I can persuade them to come along and speak for our extremely low fee, but usually I can do that. Which means it could be writers, it could be politicians, there are academics too, but from very different countries, different disciplines. And I learn a great deal through this work. My work has gained a great deal, because I really am not just or primarily working with philosophy. The questions which I ask are still philosophical questions, but the answers are coming from a broad spectrum of perspectives and experience. So I am learning a great deal from this, and I have a feeling that I can contribute to general public discourse in the kind of way that is not so frequent at university. So, short CV. Well, that is really fascinating. But what I would like you to talk about briefly, if you could, is being a woman in this world, not just the world of philosophy, but in the academic world, in the US, in Germany, before the wall, after the wall. A lot of women still have big problems combining careers with private life, and people write about reconciling professional and private life. How do you see it? I'll tell you very happily how I see it. If we were in the United States or in Israel, the other two countries where I've worked, you wouldn't ask me that question. I'm sorry if I get a bit worked up about this, but Germany is so backward on this question. Germany is about 25 years behind other countries. Nobody. Okay, wait a minute. Not quite true that people don't talk about reconciling profession and family. But let me tell you at what level that happens. There was an article about 2 years ago, 18 months ago, by, I can't remember her name, political scientist. She was a professor in Princeton, and she got some job in Washington under Hillary Clinton at the State Department. And she wrote an essay which was discussed a great deal about the impossibility of reconciling career and family. What did she mean by career? She was working 15, 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. No, you can't reconcile that. But of course, there are certain jobs, maybe in the State Department, where people work like that. I think it's a real shame. And if you read really honest reports by people who've worked for the defense ministry or a foreign ministry, they say as well, it's not just that they didn't have any time, and I'm talking about men here, I'm thinking about a few biographies. Not only did they not have time for their families, they didn't have time to take decisions properly. Things were happening so fast. But that's another issue. For ordinary mortals, professors, doctors, lawyers who are women, this is not an issue anymore. At least not in the way you still have here in Germany. I don't have a single woman friend who is not working. I don't have a single woman friend who hasn't got children. Yeah? Of course, conditions could be better. We could have more full-day schools in Germany, for example. But it really is also about attitude. Conditions in the United States are much tougher. There is no protection for pregnant women. There is no maternity leave, nothing. Even worse, and that's something people don't think about when they start with small children, in a lot of places, there's no public transport. And if there is any public transport in places like New York, children aren't allowed to travel on their own. That means that my brother and sister-in-law, for example, apart from their 2 jobs, okay, my sister-in-law, when the children were small, worked a bit less, but she always worked 4 days. Half the time they are chauffeuring their kids around to school, to sport, to music lessons, to what they call play dates, where they meet their friends. I could give you a whole list of examples of these bad conditions. Nevertheless, people are having children. So, from that point of view, being a woman, what does that mean? My children are growing up in a different world from the one I did, and I think that's a fine thing. For example, I didn't have any female professors. And until I came to Germany, actually, with Margarete von Brentano. That was the first woman, but by that time I was 28. My son, on the other hand, who's an artist, when he studied art, he had a lot of, almost exclusively, female professors. And for him, it's not an issue that women have authority. And for my girls, it's not an issue that, of course, women go out to work. And, of course, also have children. But although after 25 years we have made a bit of progress, I didn't begin to feel, although, wait a minute, perhaps I was, no, I wasn't naive. There weren't many women studying philosophy, you have to say. It wasn't exactly a career for women. But there were a few, and I never thought anything but, I can do this too. So from that point of view, this protracted brooding about should I do a PhD, am I able to? It simply wasn't a question. If I wanted, and I had fallen in love with philosophy. If I wanted to stay with it, I would have to write a PhD and I would have to become a professor. Later, I had the idea of dropping out, working freelance as a writer, earning my living that way, and I did that for a few years in Berlin, between the PhD and leaving. But to be quite honest, it's really more... It's a problem here. It's something people here always ask me about. How do you manage to do that? Or why on earth do you do that? But, of course, if you have children and you have a job in the first few years, you miss out on a few things. Reading for your own pleasure, for example, there's no time for that. Or other things that you might quite like to do for yourself. But you know that this time is going to be relatively limited. Sometimes children need more attention, sometimes they need less. And it all happens very quickly. But now you've told us all this, what would really interest me is what still, or what has always driven you, fascinated you in philosophy, being a philosopher? Not just the academic side, but what is the good thing about it for you? To be quite honest, I'm not in love with philosophy anymore. That's normal though, isn't it? You fall in love, but it doesn't last. No, I know people who've spent their whole lives being in love with philosophy and have never looked for anything else. I do think that philosophy is engaged with the most important, some of the most important questions, and so many questions that potentially you could say there's a philosophy for arts and aesthetics, a philosophy for the sciences, philosophy, etc. Theoretically, you could use philosophy to think about anything at all. In practical terms, it's often quite disappointing what a lot of philosophers produce, because they only read other philosophers and have a few thoughts, but they don't experience a great deal of the world outside and other subjects, history, anthropology, sociology, what's going on there, and literature. If I could have a second life, I might perhaps become just a writer. Literature really means a great deal to me. But as I only have the one life, and I do write, I recently completed a novel which hasn't been published yet. I write philosophy in a way which a lot of people who don't like my work tell me is too literary. But, okay, I don't know if I've answered your question or if I can answer it, because I think that philosophy is, if it's in the right hands, if you learn it from the right people, it's good for everyone. It's about learning critical thinking, and that's always a gain. It doesn't matter where it takes you. Well, perhaps it doesn't matter isn't quite right. Perhaps it does matter. But, as I said, there are a lot of developments in philosophy today which I am really not so happy about, so that I actually find it difficult to encourage talented young students, talented young people, to go for it. I always associate that with a warning. I say you will have to go through an incredibly long process of training where you will very likely, where everything possible will be done to make you forget the questions that originally encouraged you to study. And you will constantly have to look at smaller and smaller questions and treat them with a jargon that you must have full command of if you want to have any chance of earning your livelihood from this. Quite recently, one of my really most gifted pupils of all time, and I had really been trying for some time to persuade him to complete his doctorate. Just that. And he simply wasn't getting enough out of it that he could identify with at university. He'd studied both here in Germany and in the US. And okay, so now he's writing. Recently he said to me, almost apologetically, you tried everything you could, but I'm not going to do it. And I said, well, it was just important to me that you really do write something. You can write, do something creative. And if it's a documentary film and not a doctorate, then fine. So let's come to your new work. And once again, it's another really fascinating book. It's called Why Grow Up? And it's coming out in German in February. But we can take a look at it now. Because it's so interesting, we don't want to wait for the German version. And you describe how growing older can be positive and how our mature life can be the best time of our life. A lot of studies demonstrate that empirically. But how do you substantiate that, and what gave you this idea? Well, really, I have to thank Wolfram Eilenberger from the Philosophy magazine, or maybe it's to his credit, because he did an interview with me, a very long interview, and he came along and he'd read everything I had written, and he said, you know, your whole work, I think, is about growing up. And I thought, that could be true. So I started on that book. But the book really does start with a question which has been on my mind for some time. Why the hell is the toughest time in our lives, the time between the age of about 17 and 27, more or less, why are we constantly told that it's the best time of our lives when everyone who is caught up in it, or almost everyone, are really unhappy? I don't know anyone who has put it behind them, who would like to go back to that age. Heaven forbid. I'm so happy to have come through it sane and healthy. Nevertheless, we're constantly told that's the message, it's the best time in your life. I believe the idea is to prepare young people for expecting less and less from life and demanding less and less from life. It's a pretty perfidious message because it makes it harder for young people and it makes it harder for old people as well. And then I came back to Kant's essay again, What is Enlightenment? If you only know one text by Kant, it's going to be What is Enlightenment? And he says enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed nonage. Self-imposed nonage, yes. We all know this. We're lazy, we're cowardly, and it's much easier to let other people do the thinking for us than to think for ourselves. We all know that. But interestingly, this is a huge mea culpa. In the neoliberal message, it's the only thing it trumpets. There is nothing in society which is really problematic, which you can't tackle with a little bit more courage and thinking for yourself. And this essay, or at least the first paragraph in this essay, leaves us with a pretty bitter taste in our mouth. I know a lot of Germans who roll their eyes when they only hear that term, self-imposed nonage. But then he goes straight on to say, that's not just something we're to blame for personally, it's society. It's easier for society to live with infantilized consumers. Of course, Kant doesn't talk about consumers because he's describing feudal relations and not neoliberal society. But it's the same point at issue. Of course we're lazy, of course we like an easy life. But the powers that be, the people who govern us in every society, know very well how to make use of our desire for an easy life to keep us in this state of nonage, not making our own decisions, and that's the interesting thing. What's also interesting is at the symposium for the 60th birthday of Nido Rumelin, where you were invited to speak along with people like Jürgen Habermas, really the creme de la creme, you spoke in that context about growing up, and you mentioned that technology maintains us in an infantile state, meaning that we're so busy all the time with the functions and updating the software and the hardware that we actually waste a lot of time, more time than we actually save by using the technologies. And this leads to us being easier to manipulate, not only in the NSA sense. And you propose taking digital holidays. Can you tell us a bit more about that? Yes, the criticism of certain uses of technology is nothing new in my work. And there are a lot of studies that demonstrate how much time we waste. What struck me was this question of control and distraction. How do you distract a baby? A baby starts crawling about, starts reaching out for objects. This is an amazing achievement, actually, this coordination of hand and eye movement. And sometimes they reach for the wrong things, maybe a pair of glasses, a sharp object. What do? You distract the baby. Babies are very easily distracted. And if you really don't want to be an autocrat and hit the kid, you learn to distract. You do that. As you raise children, it gets harder and harder as they get older, but there are always ways. Through a whole abundance of things, we are distracted. Which smartphone shall I buy? Because of planned obsolescence, everything breaks. Everything we depend on breaks faster and faster. Even if I say I want the same one as last time, so I don't have to learn a new program, you can't have it. We are forced, willy-nilly, to spend a lot of time learning how to use the equipment that now controls our lives. Okay, I benefit from this. I'm not a Luddite. I am not a total enemy of the internet. I just notice how my life has changed. And I realized this I started to think about this a few years ago. I started to take a break in the summer. And I went off for 6 weeks for the first time for a writing break. And in those 6 weeks, I read and wrote more than in the whole year prior to that. I had the feeling that my brain had been through a detox. And I had a completely fresh concentration. I try to do that every year now. And I tell a lot of people about it. And they say, I wouldn't be able to do that. Okay, almost anywhere in the world, you can find an internet cafe and you can go in twice a week to make sure that you don't miss anything incredibly important. But it's really liberating, and I will try to carry on doing this for the rest of my life. Although I know that when I'm at home, caught up in my work, I do reach for these things like you do for a cigarette. You promised that you would make us a gift and read a page from the new German version. This is a premiere, because it hasn't been printed yet. I'm looking forward to it, and here is the page. But this is the original English. You need not be Peter Pan to feel uneasy about the prospect of becoming adult. Indeed, it's easy to argue that Peter Pan, most drastically imitated by Michael Jackson, is an emblem of our times. Being grown up is widely considered to be a matter of renouncing your hopes and dreams, accepting the limits of the reality you are given, and resigning yourself to a life that will be less adventurous, worthwhile, and significant than you supposed when you began it. Simone de Beauvoir ended the 3rd volume of her autobiography with the reflection that there wasn't much of the world she hadn't seen. The opera of Peking, the arena of the Huelva, the dunes of El Oued, the dawns in Provence, Castro talking to 500,000 Cubans, the white nights of Leningrad, an orange moon over the Piraeus. Not only did she travel the world at a time when, unlike ours, such travel could hardly be taken for granted, the loves and the friendships, the meaningful work, and the acclaim for it were nearly as numerous and varied as the places she saw. It's hard to imagine a life more full or less wasted. Yet she concludes the enviable list of her travels with a look back at the girl she once was. I quote, "Gazing at the gold mine at my feet, a whole life to live," and concludes that she was cheated. Some writers argue that few people these days want to grow up. But if adulthood is a matter of feeling in one's more honest moments that one was cheated, who can blame them? Fantastic. Now, the very last question, which is important to us and to our audience. You have so much experience of cultures, travel, philosophy, and gender. Can you tell us what is the most important thing in life? No. Because I don't believe there is one most important thing. You understand? I heard someone say yesterday, someone said something I really liked, that life consists of problems you have to solve, one after the other. That's not my motto, I'm just saying. To claim there is one thing that is the most important in life, I don't think. Every answer would be narrow, restrictive. You could say something trivial like stay open to experience or love, or Freud apparently said love and work, but there are psychoanalysts who would disagree with that and claim he never said it. These are all important things, but to claim that there is one most important thing, perhaps, and this isn't as trivial as it sounds, stay alive and kicking. Sometimes I give lectures and people say, but you're so alive. And I think, well, what am I supposed to be, dead? Yeah, stay alive, maybe. Sounds tautologous, but it isn't. Thank you very much. Thank you for that really fascinating conversation.